With an older graphics card, do you need 12 gigabytes of VRAM, 8 gigabytes of VRAM, or 6 gigabytes of VRAM just to get by in 2025? Well, in today's video, we're going to answer that exact question. And this is simply because we have here three different versions of the RTX 2060. That is, we've got the original vanilla RTX 2060 6GB, and then we've also got the RTX 2060 Super, which was released a bit later after the 2060, more or less an update to it, but it was actually a much better graphics card in terms of its specs on the spec sheet. And then later on after that, Nvidia released the 12GB model, which is a bit of an oddity, as you'll see with the specifications here up on the screen, featuring the same amount of CUDA cores as the 2060 Super, but then having more VRAM than the 2060 Super, but then still retaining the 192 memory bit bus as the original 2060 6GB, making it a bit of an odd ball, so to speak. However, if you're like me and you love used PC parts, you may be wondering, okay, is the VRAM going to stop us from getting a 60 average FPS experience at either 1080p or 1440p with these three different GPUs? And so what we're going to do is get into more of the games here, where the first title is a recent release called Dune Awakening. And what we can see here is that the original 6GB RTX 2060 is actually starting to struggle a little bit with not just the 0.1% lows, but also the visual fidelity of the image being presented. In other words, Nvidia are being the driver magicians and making it so that the card, instead of just going for a completely unplayable experience, they're dropping the visual fidelity, and that's making it so that the game is still somewhat playable. But that's only one of the 8 titles we've tested here today. Let's get on to some more interesting results right after today's video sponsor.
Do you need to get Windows 10 or Windows 11 activated and don't want to spend $200 or some other exorbitant price? Well, if so, today's video sponsor VIP SCD Keys has you covered. For as little as $15 using the coupon code BFTYC, you can get Windows 10 activated, and for a little bit more you can get Windows 11 activated too. Links in description below to find out more.
Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and let's continue this rodeo here with Final Fantasy. This is where we've got the settings put in the graphs. So what I'm going to show you is not just the side-by-side comparisons between these three RTX 2060s, but I'm also going to put these settings down the bottom, and as well when we show the graphs, we're going to put the settings up the top there, because I have used, as we said earlier, different settings, because I am trying to achieve, as we said earlier, 60 average FPS roughly, or at the very least. And so I'm changing the settings depending on the game to get that desired 60 average FPS. However, as we see in Final Fantasy, most of the time here, since the 2060 is an older graphics card, I do have to utilize DLSS. If I don't, I'm just going to get stuck at either a 30 or sub 30 FPS experience, which is really undesirable, at least for me personally. I'd say ultimately, however, this wasn't that bad of a title for the 6GB card, but on the same token, the 8GB card and the 12GB card performed actually pretty impressive. However, moving on to a newer title like Doom, this one is a bit of a VRAM intense game where they do recommend you have at least 8GB of VRAM. And here's where, with this title, we did see a drop in visual quality on the 2060 6GB, as well as at 1440p, we did start to see the 0.1% lows start to suffer on the 6GB card. Surprisingly, the 8GB card here on the Super did do better in average FPS, but also just felt slightly better than the 12GB card. Now keep in mind, it is what looks like a more aggressive overclock on the Galax card here with the 2060 Super, but in some titles you'll see here, we're getting sometimes 10% or even more, as we'll see in some titles coming up very soon, more average FPS on the Super as opposed to the 2060 12GB, meaning that 256-bit wide bus on the memory is doing a fantastic job for this card versus the 192-bit bus. However, onto a game that's recently got a massive discount. It's on sale, Hogwarts Legacy, and here's where this one is also a renowned VRAM hog. And this is certainly the case for the 2060 6GB, unfortunately, where it just started to have not just reduced visual fidelity, but also started to have some of these weird artifacts in parts of the game where I can just show you guys on the screen exactly what was happening here. And the 0.1% lows were lower than the other two cards in the charts here. However, that said, the 8GB Super did alleviate the problem and then some, being quite a smooth experience and pretty much getting rid of all the problems that was plaguing the 2060 6GB. The 2060 12GB was getting less performance than the Super, meaning that in this particular title, the 12GB, just like pretty much all the titles thus far, wasn't doing much for this 60 average FPS experience over the 8GB. Now, that's not to be said that the 12GB is completely useless, but I think with this older card trying to achieve 60 average FPS, we do have to lower the settings. And so what in today's video I'm trying to do is establish a base for the newer cards that I'm going to be testing out very soon. That's the 5060 8GB and the 9060 XT 8GB, where I believe they are substantially more powerful than these cards in today's video, but they still retain an 8GB VRAM buffer, which is going to make for a very interesting comparison where I think on the newer cards, the 8GB may not simply be enough. So moving on to a competitive online multiplayer title here, Marvel Rivals. Here is where the 2060 Super actually did pretty well. It did the best of the bunch here, and the 2060 6GB unfortunately started to suffer a bit, at least at 1080p. Despite that being a lower resolution in this game, I actually decided to turn the settings up to high with no upscaling, just because we were able to get over 60 average FPS on the 2060 Super, and also the 2060 12GB was coming right around that level. However, this is where the 0.1% lows did start to take a beating, not just on the 6GB card, but also on the 12GB card. So it goes to show that you do want, not just all the time, more VRAM, but also that bigger bit bus, especially in relation to the total bandwidth of the memory itself. And in this case, it's actually doing the 2060 Super a favor over that of the 2060 12GB, despite it having 4GB less VRAM. On to the next title here, Star Wars Outlaws. This was probably one of the most interesting titles I tested, just simply because this couldn't run properly on the 2060 6GB to the point where it just dropped the visual fidelity that much, where then the average FPS was higher than that of the 12GB model. I found that very bizarre when I started seeing this, and I double checked my results, but sure enough, the game just looked worse. And then it performed roughly the same as the 12GB, despite the 12GB model being, as we said earlier, more powerful. But then we go on to the 2060 Super 8GB, and this was actually performing really well yet again in this title, but also substantially faster than the 12GB model, meaning this card is memory bandwidth starved as opposed to being VRAM starved, at least at these settings that we're using for this particular game to get that sweet spot FPS for a budget gamer. Though going on to Warhammer Space Marine 2, here is where we yet again saw a drop in visual fidelity, just like Star Wars Outlaws on the 6GB model, and that was performing actually sometimes slightly better than the 12GB model. But then the 2060 Super came through with the same visual fidelity as the 12GB model, but also scoring higher performance. However, with that aside, it's time for the last title here, and that is Cyberpunk. And this one really shows that NVIDIA has spent a lot of time optimizing this game, where we can see that this actually runs fine on the 2060 6GB, both at 1080p and 1440p. Now keep in mind, we are using the DLSS upscaling, but they just dropped the recent update with the Transformer model. And this was one of the shining star games for NVIDIA to talk about how good their DLSS upscaling was. However, besides all NVIDIA's marketing, it is good to see that the 6GB card can at least play this game somewhat functionally well without dropping off the visual fidelity, as we saw in a lot of the previous titles that we've tested here today. Though now the final thing to talk about with these three GPUs is the power consumption, and because the 2060 6GB has less VRAM as well as less CUDA cores, it's going to use a little bit less power than the 2060 Super. However, the final thing to talk about is the actual rarity of the 12GB model, the RTX 2060. This one was really weird, where I think NVIDIA decided to just release a heap more cards during that crypto boom that was going on and the GPU shortage, at least for gamers. And here is where they released this model to, I guess, really no good effect when the 2060 Super was back then more desirable. But even now, I think it's still more desirable because there's just so many more out there on the used market. And in fact, the prices are still pretty decent. This 2060 12GB, I just couldn't find it anywhere for sale on eBay or even locally. And the only way I managed to get one was via a used PC parts hunt in Tokyo, Japan, where it just popped up for not a bad price. It wasn't that bad of a price. However, that said, it wasn't the best price for the GPU, and I pretty much just more or less wanted to find out how it performed, especially in these modern day titles, and do this VRAM comparison for you guys. Anyhow, with all that aside, it's time to wrap up today's video, at least with these older cards. Now, I think when it comes to the newer cards, the 8 GB of VRAM is not going to be enough. And I think just going into these tests here today, we're going for that average FPS experience of 60, and we got it on the 8 GB and 12 GB cards. But as we said before in this video, they're just not as powerful as these newer cards. The 2060 Super is not going to be as powerful as a 5060 or a 9060 XT for that matter. And so on those newer cards, I believe, I've got to test this still, you're gonna have to push the higher settings if you want to play around 60 FPS, but you could come into some VRAM limitations, which I'm gonna be using all these games I've tested here today at higher settings with the newer cards to see how they perform. But that said, the cards that we tested here today, the 2060 Super, I believe, was the best choice, where the 8 GB back then, it was holding up, and even to this day, it's barely holding up, as opposed to the 6 GB card, which is just not getting the job done, whether it's got a lot of stuttering and or it's just got a drop in visual fidelity, which I found really off-putting when I was benchmarking a lot of these games here today. So 6 GB is definitely a no-go going forward in terms of recommendations for me personally with VRAM. But then when it comes to 8 GB, it's definitely the bare minimum, but I'd be very concerned going forward with that being the bare minimum now. And then the newer games, if they're more demanding and they can achieve 60 average FPS, you may come into some issues with 8 GB very soon. So maybe we can revisit our 2060s in a couple of years yet again and see what the go is. And maybe that 12 GB will start being the winner. But that said, the 12 GB is just nowhere to be found, at least if you want to get one. And the 2060 Super, that's actually quite a bit more expensive than the 2066 GB. So it definitely seems like the market knows what's up when it comes to that 6 GB of VRAM versus 8 GB of VRAM with the Super versus the non-Super vanilla 2060. Anyhow, guys, with all that out of the way, hope you enjoyed today's comparison with VRAM sizes on the older GPUs. Look forward to getting you out that comparison with the newer cards. And also, if you've stayed this far and you're enjoying that Tech Yes content, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to know anything more about the testing or any of the things in today's video, be sure to drop a comment down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can, as well as if you stayed this far and you're enjoying that Tech Yes content, be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell, get the content as soon as it drops. And with that aside, I'll see you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.